So in section 3, life during wartime, we're going to take a look at things not completely away from the battlefield. We're not going to look at specific battles, but we're going to talk a little bit more about the wartime experience, both for people who were fighting in the war. So we will talk a little bit about some of the soldiers fighting on both the Union side and Confederate side, but we're also going to talk a lot here about how the war affected people off of the battlefield, how this affected the home front, the economies of both in North and South, and we'll see how both of those fared and how the war did change a lot of things. In some ways it changed things temporarily, and in other ways it changed things permanently and kind of set the United States on a new course, on a new path, on a more definite path when it came to the economic future of the United States. So let's begin by talking about African American service in the war. One of the previous things we talked about was the Emancipation Proclamation, and we said that the Emancipation Proclamation did not literally free anybody at that point in time because it only applied to states in the Confederate or that were in rebellion, so only the Confederacy, which of course was not going to abide by the Emancipation Proclamation. But one thing that we can say that the Emancipation Proclamation did do right then, as well as turning the war into a fight to end slavery, is it did also mean that African Americans could enlist in the Union Army. So that is one of the immediate changes that it brings about, is it means that African American soldiers could enlist in the Union Army, and thousands of them do so, probably about 10,000 or so. African Americans served in the Union Army during the Civil War. And this is an extraordinary thing. African Americans had not been allowed to enlist in the United States military actually since the American Revolution. That was the last time that you saw a racially integrated army. Now, of the African Americans signing up for service in the Union Army, many of them were already free before the war, but there are plenty that were not. There are plenty of slaves that would run away and join the Union Army, or that would join the ranks of the Union Army whenever the Union Army showed up or got close to wherever they happened to be. So it is probably more people that were free at the time, but there were plenty of slaves as well. Now, as far as African American service in the Confederate Army, there is some. The Confederacy, as you can probably imagine, was far more reluctant to enlist African Americans who would have been slaves, of course, in the South. So the South will enlist African American service, but not until the very end. It won't be until the final, certainly year, probably even really the last months of the war, when the South was kind of getting down to their last people. And even then, African American service in the Confederacy would look a lot different. They wouldn't be, they would mostly be doing menial tasks, not being sent to the front lines usually. So African American service is predominantly in the Union Army, and we shouldn't forget that there were thousands also serving in the Union Navy. However, there are, of course, limitations to their service, restrictions on their service, and things about their service that were not treated the same, and ways that they were not treated fairly. One of the realities of African American service in the Union Army is that it was a segregated army. So they did fight in segregated units with other African American soldiers. So they were not integrated into other regiments and other parts of the army with their white counterparts. So there are several different regiments throughout the Union Army that were specifically African American regiments. The most famous of those was the 54th Massachusetts. So the 54th Massachusetts is one of many examples of an African American regiment during the Civil War, but this is probably the most famous one that fought in a lot of major campaigns and a lot of major engagements, and became well known for their heroism and their bravery. If you have seen or heard of the movie Glory with Denzel Washington, that is about the 54th Massachusetts. It's another one of the reasons why it is so famous. It's one of the reasons why they chose to make a movie about it, but the movie is also a reason why it remains very much thought of for a lot of people. But we should also remember that in addition to fighting in all African American units and not being integrated amongst their white counterparts, African American soldiers in the Union Army still faced a great deal of discrimination, as well as them being in these segregated units, which, by the way, in those segregated units, they are commanded by white officers. So they were not allowed to rise to certain ranks. They were certainly not allowed to hold certain leadership positions. And again, the people that they are taking orders from are definitely going to be white. They are not paid the same as their white counterparts, so an African American soldier of a certain rank is going to receive a lower pay than a white soldier of that exact same rank. Oftentimes they are going to be given weapons and be fighting in combat just like everybody else, but sometimes they would be kind of confined to more manual labor kind of roles, cooking and digging ditches and things like that. Laundry stuff along those lines, but that is more likely to happen in the Confederate Army than in the Union Army. And plus just the general discrimination, just being treated differently, being looked down upon, having slurs thrown at you, being punished, disproportionate to something that was done, and just being targeted and just not seen the same way. So African American service is incredibly important and incredibly crucial to the Union cause. And in that way, African Americans serving in the Union military, both in the Army and the Navy, become a visual symbol themselves of one of the things that the war stood for and one of the things that the war was about. All right, now we're going to take a look at how the war affected the economies of both the North and South, and how it would have affected people on the home front, people that were not fighting in the military, but the people that were living it, and some that might have noticed it more than others. We're going to start by talking about the Confederate economy, and we've already mentioned and talked a good bit about how overall the Confederate economy is, sorry, I'm getting my camera straight, is certainly their greatest weakness, and how many historians would argue that the Confederate economy defeats them before the Union Army does. We know that this was overwhelmingly an agricultural economy, and it just simply is not equipped to deal with and to supply a long and drawn out modern war. It just does not produce the kind of goods that would be necessary for that. It doesn't produce the kind of military supplies that would be necessary for that, and it doesn't produce the kind of wealth that would be necessary for that. Again, we've talked many times about how the South is wealthy, and there's a great deal of wealth in the South, but that's tied up in things that weren't cash, really, things that were not going to be helpful in supplying themselves for the war. So let's take a look at more specific parts of that Confederate economy and why they were specifically weaknesses. We know that in the Confederate economy, and for people on the home front in the Confederacy, they're going to have to deal with extreme shortages of supplies and food. We know that the South is agricultural and that they can produce a lot of their own food, and a lot of us probably in the beginning might have thought that was a strength of the South, is that they're agricultural and all of that, but remember that the majority of that is cotton, and you can't eat cotton. So they are going to have to shift a lot of their agricultural production over to, food supplies, over to producing corn and wheat and other things that could be used as food supplies. And they actually do a great deal of that. They're able to transition a lot. They really are able to do some very amazing things as far as the amount of shifting around and changing what they produce and where they produce it, but it's still not enough. It really is quite remarkable what they're able to do in a short amount of time, but it's not enough to address the needs that they have. And so they are going to have not just shortages of military supplies with ammunition and weapons and uniforms and shoes, but also just basic things for people on the home front. And when we talked earlier about morale, we said that the Confederacy has this advantage of high morale. Well, that morale is going to be eaten away at when there's no food at home, when there's no bread, when there are no shoes, when there's no medicine, when those things that people just at home just trying to live their lives can't get by, and people are starving to death, that morale is going to start eroding away. So those significant supplies, because they are an agricultural economy, because they're not industrialized, that really is going to have a major effect on them. As far as money, now both sides, the Union and the Confederacy, are going to have to do some things that they normally wouldn't do during the war in order to address money shortages, but we will see it play out. Although they'll do something a little bit similar, it plays out a little bit differently. Because there is a money shortage during the war, and that's common during wartime, the South resorts to printing paper money. We've talked about that in the past. We talked about how the American colonies did that during the American Revolution, something that was commonly done when there were money shortages. But the problem with that is that it leads to inflation. If you're printing and printing and printing all of this paper money, the value of it goes down, making it eventually kind of worthless. And so Confederate money, certainly by the end of the war, was worth absolutely nothing. One, because they had printed so much of it, then the inflation rate was ridiculous, but also because by the end of the war, the Confederate government has fallen apart, and so there's no legitimate government to back that money up either. And so a lot of people in the Confederacy that had put all their money into Confederate corporate money, or that's all they had, that becomes essentially useless. So that just erases a huge amount of wealth right there. So the paper money thing causes serious inflation. Prices are just soaring through the roof, and this money is becoming absolutely worthless. Now, one of the ways that the Confederacy finances the war is through war bonds, and war bonds work the same way that savings bonds would today. And this is a common thing that would be done in a time of war, or some other kind of financial crisis. It was done during the Revolution. You'll see it again happen during World War I and World War II. It's not an uncommon thing, but a war bond is sort of like, you buy this bond from the government, in this case the Confederacy, and it's kind of like loaning them your money. The idea being that after a certain amount of time, 20 years, 30 years, however long the bond is for, you would get your money back plus interest. So you're giving the government a loan, kind of. Well, this is done in the Union and in the Confederacy, but the problem with the Confederacy is a lot of people invested a lot of money in these war bonds. Some people maybe even all of their money, all of their fortune, everything they had into these war bonds. By the time the war is over, of course, the Confederacy's fallen apart. There is no government there to back this up, and so those war bonds turn out to be no good. So a lot of people lose everything because of those war bonds. So that's one of the reasons there's going to be just a huge destruction of the Southern economy, of Southern wealth, why there's going to be such widespread poverty and economic despair in the Confederacy once the war is over with, because those war bonds are going to be worthless and a lot of people are going to lose everything. The other thing we should remember about the Confederacy on the home front is that for the most part, the Confederacy on their land, on their territories, where most of the battles are being fought. So there is a greater sense of urgent danger when it comes to people being in the South. And so depending on what part you lived in, it was nearly a guarantee that at some point, the Union Army was going to come calling, and that's a pretty scary thing. So there are a lot of refugees throughout the South, people that have fled their home, people that have fled when they know the Union Army is close or when they're fearful. Some of those refugees, a lot of them, of course, are slaves, people that have just fled the plantation or wherever their owner's property was, or have just walked off, sometimes after their owner had already fled, and then they would leave. So there's a lot of homelessness, people that are just kind of displaced, that have fled their land, or their land has been occupied by the Union Army, or they're former slaves that had nowhere to go, or maybe they were tenants and they have nowhere to go. So they are just kind of wandering around, maybe ending up in towns or some of the South's few cities. So there's a great deal of people that are just displaced, who have no home to go to really, and that creates a lot of fear, as well as fear of what's going to happen. Fear as they see their homes being invaded, fear of what's going to happen when this is all over. There's kind of a breakdown of law and order in some places, violence and other kind of, vigilante things going on. With so many people, leaders away at war, you had these sort of home guards that were appointed to sort of, keep structure at home, but those could be quite ugly as well. So you have just kind of a breakdown of things in some places, particularly as the war goes on, as it gets into that final year, final months. So the South, certainly in places where the war was being fought more heavily, like in Virginia and parts of Georgia, depends on where you're talking about, but it could be a pretty desolate place as things were just kind of falling apart. And certainly as the Confederate government and the Confederate economy falls apart, this could be a pretty desperate place to be in. And people were, also just psychologically devastated and psychologically defeated after having committed themselves to a cause, and to see that totally defeated right in front of their face was pretty desperate situation as well. So the Southern economy, we know, does not fare very well in the war at all. It is almost totally destroyed as a result of the war. The Union economy, however, fares much better. That's not to say that everything is just great and awesome from the beginning. They will have to get creative. They will have to do some things that are different. They will have to do some things that are not always popular. But in the end, they will actually emerge from this a lot stronger and a lot bigger and a lot better. We've already mentioned how the Union economy is probably their greatest strength during all of this, because they are more diversified, they are industrialized, it's more modern, they've got roads, they've got railroads, they've got factories and industries that are going to be able to supply them with the things that they need and be able to function and be successful in helping them support this modern war. And in fact, whereas the Confederate economy is just falling apart in pieces by the end of the war, the Union economy is actually even stronger and even better, and a lot of people become very financially successful off of the war, whereas a lot of people in the South are financially ruined ruined and devastated as a result of the war. So let's take a look at some of those things that illustrate or just put a finer point on some of those things that we just mentioned about economic growth and success in the Union. In the Union, we're actually going to see a growth of industry. They're going to become even more industrialized as a result of the war. And the reasons for that are probably obvious. Obviously, during the war, there's a big demand for a lot of things. There's a demand for weapons. There's a demand for military uniforms. There's a demand for shoes. There's a demand for all kind of things. This is where you start to see the beginning of things like canned goods, canned food, because that was a different way to preserve food, and then it was very, very helpful for the military. So obviously there's a lot of opportunities there for factories to expand, for new businesses to start to meet that demand and to fill that need that was there during the war years. So industry is actually growing. It is also growing, and industrialization is also taking off because of new technology, mechanization. Mechanization looks like mechanical machines. It basically means just new technologies that are emerging to help industry, new machinery, new technologies, new ways of doing things, larger factories, faster machines, faster production times. That's speeding things up. That's enhancing production. It's increasing their productivity. And so that is fueling their industry and fueling the growth of industry as well, and making them better and helping them to support themselves during this war is that growth of mechanization. The war also brings about more industrialization because there's a sense that that was needed, and there's support for what becomes kind of known as a new American system that emerges in the Union or gets more support, becomes more popular in Union states throughout the Civil War. That new American system probably reminds you of the other American system back in the days of Henry Clay, and it is basically just sort of a resurrection of those same ideas. The idea that the national government should be strong, that the national government should support industry, that there should be high tariffs to protect industry, that there should be, government money put into building railroads and building roads and, creating an environment where industry is going to be successful. There's more support for that. Part of the reason for that was people saw the benefits of the growth of industry. Another reason for that is because the people that, if you think about leadership and people that had generally stood against industrialization and stood against tariffs and didn't want any of that, think about it. A lot of them were from the South. Well, where's the South during the Civil War? They're gone. So without Southern opposition, that paves the way for a lot of these things that a lot of Northerners, that the Republican Party supported, higher tariffs, more industry, more economic growth. We want to put more emphasis on that, westward expansion to fuel economic growth, all those things that they had wanted. They are going to have a much easier time of doing all that stuff during the Civil War because the South isn't around, our Southern leaders are not around in Congress to stop them. They're not there to block the votes. And so there's more support for these kinds of things, and they're able to get a lot of that economic agenda through. And we're going to look some more at some of those things here in just a second, including a transcontinental railroad. We've mentioned the Transcontinental Railroad in the past, that at this point was just or everything we talked about up until now had just been in the planning phases. Ever since the United States acquired land all the way to the Pacific Ocean, there had been talk about building a transcontinental railroad, a railroad to connect East Coast to West Coast, to go all the way across the United States. People felt that was necessary and important, and it had been talked about, but had never actually gotten done. There had been arguments about where to build it and all of that, but also big arguments about, do we even need it? Who's going to pay for it? This is one of those things that Southern leadership probably would have stood against. But without the South, they have kind of a much freer road to get this done. So the Transcontinental Railroad is going to be started during the Civil War years. They will start building that. They will not complete the Transcontinental Railroad until a few years after the Civil War is over with, but that is part of that economic growth agenda, westward expansion agenda, that's going to have a lot easier time during the Civil War because the South isn't there to try to stop them. So the Transcontinental Railroad is begun. Now let's talk about some other economic policies during the Civil War in the North. We mentioned that in the South, they had to print paper money in order to deal with the money shortages and all of that. Well, they have to do the same thing in the Union too. And in the Union, that paper money has a particular name. It's called greenback. So greenbacks are the paper money, or is the paper money, that was printed and used in the Union during the Civil War to try to deal with all that money shortage. So it's pretty easy to remember because if you think about money and, your paper money, it's green. Looks like, so think about that. It's paper money. It happened to be green at that time. And the reason I mentioned the greenbacks, one, this is a way that they deal with the economic struggle, increase the money supply. It does cause inflation because anytime you print money, it's going to cause inflation. However, in the Union, they are able to control that inflation a lot more. Because it's a stronger government, it's a more powerful government, they are able to regulate that a whole lot better than the Confederacy is able to do, and make sure that they print, some paper money, but not so much that it's just going to go crazy and cause super duper inflation. But a big reason why I bring the greenbacks up is because this is actually one of the first things you will look at in the 11th grade, after the Civil War is going to wrap up the slavery issue, which has kind of been the big thing. The next big super divisive issue that will come up after the Civil War a couple of years later has its roots in the Civil War, because it has its roots in this greenback thing. So just to foreshadow something you're going to talk about to come later, there will be a big discussion, a big debate, a big argument about what to do with those greenbacks once the Civil War is over, because there will be some people that like the greenbacks and want to keep them in there, in circulation, and then there'll be people that don't like the greenbacks and want the government to withdraw them. So there'll be a big debate over what's called monetary policy, monetary as in money, like greenbacks. So just keep that in mind. It's one of the things you'll look at again in the 11th grade. It becomes a big issue for several decades after, and eventually it starts out with the greenback thing, greenbacks versus no greenbacks, and eventually it evolves into a question of gold or silver. So a big monetary debate is something you'll be looking at soon, and again, it has its origins in the Civil War. Continuing on with things that the Congress, things that the United States government is able to pursue that are not necessarily related to the war during the war years. One of the things I was mentioning, this emphasis on industrialization and all of that, but that also included an emphasis on westward expansion. We had seen the past couple of years that the South was kind of standing in the way of westward expansion because they were worried about not being able to take slavery there. And a lot of Northerners wanted to expand westward and wanted people to settle there and wanted it to be economically developed and all of that. And so there are two laws that are passed by the United States Congress during the Civil War that have something to do with westward expansion. It has something to do with developing the West, encouraging people to settle the West, and encouraging the West to be suitable for farming, and encouraging people to go out there and start farming and developing the West. The first of those laws is called the Homestead Act, and again, this is something they're able to get through because the South isn't there to block them. They're not there to, because they probably would have opposed these things. The first is called the Homestead Act, which if you think about it, homestead kind of sounds like, people going out to homestead, going out west to farm. That's exactly what it is. This was designed to incentivize that. It was to encourage and to incentivize Americans to move west. Basically what it promised was it promised you land. If you went out west, you could claim land out west, and if you, quote, improved it for 5 years, I think it was like 5 years. Improved it means you developed something from it. You were able to grow a crop there. You were able to make some money off of that land by growing a crop or raising livestock or something like that. So you go out west, you claim some land. If you're able to stick it out for at least 5 years and do something productive with that land, improve it, then it's yours. You don't have to pay for it. So it's basically like land grants out to individual people, handing out land kind of for free as long as people will put in the work to make that land productive. So thousands of people will take the government up on that offer and move out west on the Homestead Act. A lot of them actually are not successful with it though, because farming the West, as you'll see later, was a lot more difficult than a lot of people thought. But it does encourage a lot of people to move out west. So this is the government taking an active role in trying to encourage westward expansion by basically offering people free land. Another law that had a similar purpose, although it's, well, similar, but has a big difference as well, but it does have to do with westward expansion, is the Morrill Land Grant Act. The Morrill Land Grant Act, what this does is it gives land grants to states, so it gives the states pieces, big chunks of land in the West, and when that land is sold, when they sell that land off to homesteaders, the states then keep the money. So they're giving the states land, but it's not like land so that they can use it, it's land so they can sell it, and then they'll get the money from those land grant sales. And then they use that money to put into schools and colleges. So this is a way for states to fund schools and colleges within their states, specifically agricultural schools and colleges. So it was giving them land that they could sell and then take the money and put that money into funding schools and colleges specifically for agriculture, so that people could learn more about agriculture, they could be better farmers, they could pioneer new farming techniques, figure out better ways to do things to make farms more productive. A lot of states, this law is expanded later on, so it does eventually include even southern states that weren't a part of it at the time. There are a lot of states that have a land grant, what's called a land grant university, that was created by or funded by the Moral Land Grant Act. Some of you may know that in Alabama, that land grant university is Auburn, which is an agriculturally based school. So the money that went into that came from the Moral Land Grant Act. And again, it gets expanded a little bit later, and that's where you get things like, some of you may be, particularly those of you involved in ag classes, FFA, anything like that. You probably know about cooperative extension programs. If you don't worry about it, but that comes out of the Moral Land Grant Act a little bit later as well. So both the Homestead Act and the Moral Land Grant Act are both ways to try to encourage Western settlement and encourage Western agriculture and to get that moving. Now, a little bit about soldiers on the battlefield, and this is kind of, just a very, very extremely brief overview of it. Obviously, there's far more to tell here than we could possibly tell, and every soldier that fought experienced different things, so it's kind of hard to put it just into a few sentences. So we're going to very much generalize kind of life for soldiers in the field. Obviously, this was a difficult situation for both Confederate soldiers and Union soldiers. The military was not, funded and didn't have the kind of supplies that it does now. So most people were using day-to-day supplies that they brought from home, particularly in the Confederacy, most likely their own weapons. A lot of them, particularly in the Confederacy, don't even have matching uniforms. Some of them may not even have shoes. Food shortages are very, very common. In some cases, they are basically foraging off of the land. So there's little food. Many of them don't have tents. Some of them do. They are walking miles and miles and miles a day. These army camps could be really, really disgusting places, as well as just the horrors of battle. For most soldiers, the food they would eat on a day-to-day basis was usually the rations were this picture here. This is something called hardtack. Looks kind of like a little Pop-Tart. It's basically a little cracker that's basically just made out of flour and water, which you can imagine probably doesn't taste very good, and certainly doesn't have a whole lot of nutritional value. So they're not incredibly well fed. It certainly was not a fun life. And also we want to mention a little bit about, let me get my, oh, there we go. Battlefield medicine. Now, the Civil War has incredibly high casualties, incredibly high, very disproportionate to what they probably could have been, and some of that has to do with the tactics and the strategies that they're using along with the weapons that they're using, and some of that has to do with the kind of battlefield medicine. You have to realize that this is before there was any knowledge of the way that germs are spread. So infections were incredibly uncommon. In fact, infection and disease kills more soldiers than actual battlefield wounds do, than actually getting just shot to death on the battlefield. More people are going to die of sickness, and many of them will die of that sickness before they even see battle. Again, these army camps can be pretty disgusting places. They have no idea at this time as to how disease is spread, and so you put all these guys in these army camps where it's not very sanitary. They're all using the same water source, where their animals are using the water and they're bathing in it and using it as a toilet and everything, and so you get these big outbreaks of disease that kill a lot of people, like I said, before you even see battle. And it just spreads these army camps like wildfire. We've seen that before. They're not very well fed, so nutrition makes them weaker and more susceptible to disease and those kind of things. But again, also with the infections, doctors, physicians, college-trained physicians, they had no idea about bacteria and viruses and how those things were spread. And so these doctors are operating on people with their bare hands and then going from person to person without washing or cleaning or anything like that. And so that is a major way that infections were spread from one person to another. They didn't have the procedures that they have today. They didn't have any antibiotics. So if you did get sick, there was nothing they could really treat treat you with. The weapons that they're using, they're much more modern and much more deadly weapons that they were using with old strategy. So these, when people got shot, bones just shattered, and they could not fix that back then. So if you got shot in the arm and the bone was, too far gone, or in the leg, the only answer was amputation. So amputations are incredibly common. People that lived through this with all four limbs were incredibly lucky, and that wasn't extremely common for a lot of people. And there are, pictures you can Google if you want to of, these field hospitals, or basically pits where they've dug, and they're just piles of arms and piles of legs where they're amputating left and right, because for most people, if you're shot in the arm or the leg, that was the only treatment they could really give you, was to remove it. So it's surprising that hardly anybody lives through it at all, with what little bit that they did know. So obviously life for people both at home and people on the battlefield was a pretty difficult, and a lot of people having to make a lot of sacrifices in a lot of different ways. And what we'll be looking at next is looking at some more specific battles and seeing the tide eventually turn, and seeing it eventually turn in favor of the Union.